The dragon is the proper zoomorphic form of Saturn Kronos. Always was from the earliest days and continues. It's not an element from Christian iconography that we're looking at. It's Hellenistic through and through.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander F., and today we are very honored to discuss the book The Game of Saturn with author, poet, and essayist Peter Mark Adams. Peter is also a practitioner of tarot. He's an esotericist and professional energy worker specializing in the ethnography and visuality of ritual in the history of art, sacred landscape, esotericism, consciousness, and healing. And The Game of Saturn is a wonderful book examining the enigmatic Renaissance masterwork, the Sola Busca Tarocchi. The book is published by Scarlet Imprint, and also a huge thanks to Alkistis and Peter from Scarlet Imprint for their consistently wonderful work. And I first learned about Peter's exquisite tome, The Game of Saturn, after a recommendation from the wonderful and erudite Ted Orville, who told me that the book was an incredible study of the Sola Busca Tarocchi. And that's indeed what Peter's tome is. By studying and adding context to the Sola Busca, Peter's tome reveals the existence of a pagan liturgical and ritual tradition active amongst members of the Renaissance elite and actually encoded within the deck. There is no detail in the deck which is not intentional. And careful analysis of the deck demonstrates that the presiding deity of this cult object is none other than the Afro-Levantine serpent dragon Baal Haman, also known as Kronos and Saturn. And in today's day and age, there seem to be new tarot decks coming out all of the time, many of them very interesting, with new symbolism, themes, and interpretations. But this deck, the Sola Busca, as Peter shares, not only is one of the oldest decks in existence, hundreds of years before the Rider-Waite tarot deck so popular today, but Peter shares in addition how the Sola Busca Tarocchi is a working system of elite Renaissance magic, now made accessible to everyone with Peter's esoteric context and historical context. And Peter also shares that the deck is a historical fingerprint of sorts between Western Europe and the Neoplatonic and pagan theurgistic practices flowing into Italy in the 1400s and before from the Byzantine Empire. And in this interview, for the first time, Peter shares new information about the deck and discusses its significance. Very exciting stuff. Peter also shares about intersubjectivity in ritual, and he shares about his current projects, which are incredibly interesting. All I can say is, wow. Peter also answers your Glitch Bottle Patreon listener questions and so much more. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, I give you Peter Mark Adams. Peter Mark Adams, thank you so much for stopping by the Glitch Bottle podcast today.
Thank you, Alex. I'm delighted to be appearing here with you. Really am.
Well, the honor is certainly mine, Peter, and thank you for the generosity of your time and your wisdom. And can you just share a little bit, Peter, about your early years and your interest in esotericism and energy and healing? How did all of this start for you personally?
I always had an acute sensitivity to energy fields, subtle energies, a sense of the eerie, of distinct presences, and also a sense about events about to unfold, of accidents or sense of prescience and of synchronicities. All of these events seem to have their own distinctive shifts in a field. So you can feel it coming. So I always had that going on. This connected to the esoteric world very early for me because at the age of about 8 or 9, I went out to live in East Africa. And on the way there, I stopped off in Cairo. So this was literally 9 or 10 months after I'd seen this huge color supplement in the newspaper in the UK showing the treasures of Tutankhamun. within a year, I was like obsessed with these things. Within a year, I was standing in front of them in Cairo Museum, and I was inside the Great Pyramid and all this. So, and then I pretty well grew up in East Africa, which is certainly in those years, the 60s was a place of absolutely outstanding natural beauty, but also of violent predation, which is another distinctive feature of the Great Plains over there. But you can guess how far I was already into this stuff, because I had a little altar to a Hellenic deity then. I was like 9 years old. So I got started early. In my early teens, I took to the roads of Britain, like just walking alone, sleeping rough, and I visited all the great sites from Walsingham in Norfolk to Glastonbury, Stonehenge and Avebury. I was just sleeping rough at night with a sleeping bag in a hedge. There's always a kind of immersiveness about this period. You're so much alone and so much immersed in the landscape. You have a kind of fusion with that, and that was another very formative experience for me. It's never left me, and hence my interest in sacred landscape today. In my late teens, I undertook martial arts training. I have to say that taught me more than you can imagine about the energy meridians and ki energy, almost more than any other conceivable path. And I was very fortunate to undertake that training with one of UK's foremost practitioners, Ronnie Colwell, now deceased. He was a 9th degree karate practitioner, 10th degree, 10th dan jiu-jitsu, Special Air Forces member, Parachute Regiment, Special Air Services, bodyguard, Special Air Services trainer. That was quite a formidable presence and example to get into that like Bushido path with. Later in life, I got introduced to the path of energy healing. In this context, it, for me, was primarily breath work. And I took training in rebirthing breath work, and with the late, great Jim Leonard, had another form of highly integrative breath work called vivation. So I was actually giving sessions with this for many years. I coupled that with some of the most recent meridian therapies, meridian energy therapies like emotional freedom techniques, which is really like state-of-the-art healing stuff that everyone should have. But that like immersion in this world of energy healing brings you very close to energy body attachments and entities and that kind of stuff. And certainly to the parasitic end of that scale, the extent to which karma as a field within a family can give rise to serious ailments, mental disturbances, and so on. So this was enormously educational. And I've managed to distill most of this information into a book I wrote some years ago called The Healing Field. And hopefully that'll be republished this fall by Inner Traditions. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing that come out. I put some of the more extreme cases from my energy healing experience onto my academia.edu website if anyone is interested. There's a series of essays there, rituals therapy. There's one, healing interventions involving deceased persons. That should. And another one, Lord of the Flies. It's the phenomenology of a case of possession I was dealing with. So this is quite rare material, which I put up there. That pretty well brings us up to date, Alex.
In addition to just the menagerie and the depth of experiences that you have, you mention, in addition to all of this, that when it comes to something like the game of Saturn, this was a book that you never planned on writing. And you kind of intimate in the book itself that it was not on your list of writing tasks, and it kind of caught you by surprise. So can you tell us about how did you first come in contact, Peter, with the Solabusca Tarocchi, and how did this kind of catch you by surprise?
I think there's always two narratives, and one of them is linear and the other comes out of left field. And one out of left field is probably the real one. So, I mean, Italy purchased this deck of cards from the last descendants, I think, of the Solar family, some around 2009. I think it was like 800,000 euro. It's, the thing is a masterwork, a Renaissance masterwork. Its fine detail is almost, unapproached then or today. because they engraved the imagery onto copper engraving plates and then printed from there. So it's really fine detail involved in it. And in 2012, they launched an exhibition with a catalogue in the Brera Gallery in Milan. I think it was the publicity generated from that event that caught my attention. So I corresponded with the personnel at the Brera Gallery then, the assistant director, Giacomo Prati, and the curator of the cards, Laura Gnaccolini. And they were very helpful. They sent me some documents, and I had been interested in tarot off and on since I was like 15 years old. And I looked at this deck and I couldn't make head or tail of it. And that really surprised me because I thought I knew what tarot was about. And I obviously didn't, you know. So the more attention I paid to this, the more I was drawn into it. I mean, it was like a question. This is incredibly rich material. Is there a pattern or an explanation for it? Because at that time, there wasn't one. I didn't even know if the deck as a whole was anything more than a fancy decoration, you know, a fancy gift from one noble family to another. But something about the imagery seemed to dispel that notion that it was in any way decorative. And I think the first insight I got into the deck was I noticed a couple of cards which seemed to have an echo or resonance of imagery from Mithraism in them. It was like the 2 of trumps, Postumio, and the 11 trumps, the Tullio, and they had an upward and downward torch in them, you know. That was really characteristic of like Mithraic initiatory symbolism. And then just as a hypothesis then, I threw that out, you know, to myself and said, well, look, if you got the torchbearers, is the Mithraic bull-killing scene depicted in the deck, in however deeply encoded? And so I started looking, and a card comes out. It's called Deo Toro. And it's an allusion, actually, to a historical figure, but it's misspelt. His name was Diatorus. He's a Galatian. He wasn't even Roman. A Galatian governor of a remote province. But they had like split the name into 2 and simplified it. So it read Deo Toro. And I thought, well, that's kind of bullish, right? So I thought, well, okay, if I've got the torchbearers and I've got the bull, you know, is Mithras in here somewhere? And I started digging and digging. And in the southern Anatolian tradition where Mithraism appears to have emerged, Mithras and Perseus were identified with each other. And Perseus is a constellation. And part of the Perseus constellation has an asterism called the head of Medusa, of which the left star is the eye of the Medusa. It's Algol, the fixed star. And I found that like kind of encoded in one of the cards. So I thought, wow, if this lot are in there, what is the significance of the grouping? And of course, it's the fact that the 2 torches represent the solstices. And the solstices are the gates of the sun in Plato, the pathway or portal through which souls enter and leave mortal existence. And at this point, I thought, right, stop there. This is unbelievable. This is real deep metaphysics encoded in this Renaissance masterwork. I need to develop some perspective around this. That's when I started thinking in terms of what would they have known in the Renaissance? What were the possible sources that they could have for this imagery? And what additional sources would lead on from there? So I needed to step right back into the Renaissance effectively. Forget all of the information I'd gleaned about tarot iconography and, you know, Tarot de Marseille, the Rider-Waite, all of this, the Crowley deck. Forget everything I'd learned about it and go back to square one based on the kinds of source materials that would have been accessible to a Renaissance scholar. And so I had to repiece the process of how this deck was made. And that's really where the so-called ethnographic turn in interpretation emerged from. Let me just spell out a couple of important pointers in that road that I went along. One of the linchpins was the work of a renowned art historian, Professor Mark J. Zucker. He's deceased now, he was the world's leading expert on northern Italian engravings of the 15th century. And he did a study of the solar buska's imagery and compared it to the corpus of engravings that he knew from 15th century Ferrara. And he said, this is a body of work by one artist that he dubbed the master of the solar buska, Tarocchi. And that dates the work for late 15th century. 1491 is the original date we extract from one of the images from the deck. And his expertise firmly places this in that late 1480, 1490 period of Ferrara engraving. So once that is like pegged to the ground, a lot of other stuff, it blows away other readings. For instance, some people have attempted to give a date 100 years later to the deck. 1570 is talked about, and they try and justify it by reading the Latin on the shield as an anagram for another statement that points towards that date. Well, that's gone now. It's unsustainable. Until you bring a scholar of an equal stature to Mark Zucker, who can suggest that, no, the deck was engraved by somebody else, then we have to go with this. This is a consistent interpretation now. But I'd urge anyone interested in this to get hold of Mark Zucker's paper. It's The Master of the Solar Buska Tarocchi and the rediscovery of some Ferrarese engravings of the 15th century. And it's in the art journal, Artibus et Historiae, volume 18, number 35, 1997. It is a linchpin for all solar buska serious research. Okay, it's like, that's where you start. The other thing I'd like to tackle right up front is that the deck was finalized by being painted. The coat of arms were with gilt, inlaid silver, impressed. They are the coat of arms of the Venetian Venia and Sanudo families. So when the initials MS appear in the deck, and there's a whole scattering of these coats of arms, always Venia or Sanudo, we're pretty sure that it is Marin Sanudo that this deck was decorated for. He's the youngest child of Leonardo Sanudo, a major figure in the Venetian elite, and his mother, Letizia Venier, descendant of one of the Roman imperial houses. So this is a second linchpin to getting the study of this deck in perspective, okay, in focus. I then pursued the background of, what kind of process would they go through to create this deck? And I turned to art historian Michael Baxendall. He did an absolute classic work, Painting an Experience in Renaissance Italy. It's a must-read for anybody who wants to understand the process of creation in Italian art. And this is really where the ethnography, so to speak, bites in now, because the process, the typical process, shows you how the solar buska was put together, and therefore what you need to do in order to decode it. So typically the steps in this process would be the patron creates a commission with a specific end in view. Our view of art as decorative does not apply in this context, okay? These Renaissance princes commissioned works of art as part of their diplomatic and dynastic maneuverings. So, for instance, Borso d'Este created this magnificent illuminated Bible. This was not for his personal enjoyment. It went with him everywhere. He set it up in a room by itself, and then he controlled who could see it and who couldn't see it. So that it became a way of bestowing a favor and creating an obligation. And this is more the kind of frame we need to hold this kind of Renaissance art in, is more along these lines than along the lines of decoration, okay? So once the patron has decided on investing scarce resources in a project like this, he would typically enroll one of his humanist scholars at the court to articulate his intent. The scholar would then consult classical literary sources, identifying passages that illustrate the theme, and then he would select and structure these narratives so that they formed at least 4 distinct layers of meaning. So the polysemy, the multiple layers of meaning, is integral to this process. It's not an add-on or anything else. It's integral. And this had been the practice for millennia, actually, not just during the Renaissance. So typically you would create symbolism and imagery which could be read on a literal level, a moral, an allegorical, and an anagogical or spiritual level. And you see this exemplified, for instance, in Botticelli's Primavera. It has all these layers in there, okay? So the introduction of this degree of polysemy is integral to the design process. Now, this is important for when we start deconstructing the imagery, right? So he converts the passages into images, and then he writes a long-form description of the desired imagery. Now, at this point, he hasn't even talked to an artist. He specifies the figures, their groupings, posture, the gestures, their clothing, the coloration, the background, and the appearance of any objects. This is then finally passed to the artist, who draws up some drafts. The drafts are then brought back to the patron and the scholar. They'll agree one of them or a group of them, and then they turn the draft over and they write on it the material requirements, the costs of that, the delivery timescales, and any other related, what payments are going to be made and when. And then all parties sign the document. It's a contract. Okay, so this is how the Solar Busker was made. They had to do 78 draft sheets like this and then hand them to the artist for execution. So at this stage, we can derive three key principles that the Solar Busker is likely to embody. That's inherent polysemy. It's no good to come along and say, this figure is such and such a historical figure from Plutarch. Okay, that's one layer. That's it. What about the rest? There's always an excess of imagery in every single trump card, for instance, that cannot be explained by the historical figure. It points beyond itself. Secondly, non-redundancy. Nothing is superfluous in these cards. If you can't explain it, you just can't explain it, but it's there for a reason, given the process of specification that the image has gone through. And thirdly, completeness. All details are relevant. So these three principles are at the heart of any accurate interpretation of the deck's imagery. Doesn't mean we can always reach this standard. And I have to tell you right now, 80% of the suit cards are still undeciphered. Okay. My work has been the trumps and the court cards and a few of the suit cards that were opened up as a result of that. But there's still stuff embedded in there that, you know, is beyond my reach even today. So I just hope there's other people going to come forward and start filling these gaps in, you know. So that's really how the ethnographic process worked itself out for me. Okay, it gave me a clear process of approach to the decoding.
In the book, you definitely make a point to use and employ the word Tarocchi versus tarot. And I know so many listeners are familiar with tarot, but can you just elucidate a little bit about using Tarocchi?
Yeah, right. The tradition of what came to be called tarot cards started out as gaming decks. Basically, they took a game from the Middle East, which is like the four suits that are familiar from a normal deck of cards. And they enhanced the game by adding 22 trump cards, which generally were based on like the estates of man, you know, beggar, magician, prince, princess, this kind of thing, and certain planetary entities and some Christian type imagery, you know, the end of times or resurrection and that. So this became like standard iconography for playing a specific game called Tarocchi by about 1430, certainly. And these decks were fairly routinely produced in Ferrara from that date. We have invoices from that far back. So this is half a century before the Solar Busker is even thought about. Basically, that game then is called Tarocchi. When that game migrated, let's say, to France, it came to be called tarot. But it's still played as a game in large part of Eastern Europe, you know, Italy, Austria, France, places like Switzerland. For most Westerners, you know, certainly for people like myself, I've only ever known tarot as a fortune-telling device, as a divination tool. So like meeting up with its early ancestor, which is just a game, is a bit like culture shock, you know. How do you square this circle? But one unfortunate effect of this, like, two continents meeting, is that highly authoritative figures in the history of tarot, like Michael Dummett did the 2-volume history of the tarot, was very scathing of any idea of an esoteric tarot. As far as he was concerned, it's like an 18th century invention. And so kind of with this interpretation of the solar bus guy, I've like upended that. And that hasn't sat on a lot of people very well. It's like, you know, whoa. That's a bit of a challenge. It upends orthodox history of tarot cards. And it's a big challenge for people to accept that. I acknowledge that, you know.
With this kind of upending that you've revealed through your scholarship and in the game of Saturn, you were touching on there's all these different themes that are kind of tributaries fueling the deck's creation. There's a lot of historical forces, there's the Byzantine Empire, there's Neoplatonic thought. Can you just kind of set the historical stage for the listeners who might not be too familiar? What was going on in Ferrara and in Italy during the early to mid 1400s regarding inter-Italian wars and also the Byzantine Empire that were really influencing how this deck came about?
Okay, let's just do like a whistle-stop tour of a chunk of history. We can actually start because it's like a domino sequence in Byzantium. The empire had been under persistent pressure from the Ottoman armies for some centuries. You know, initially the Seljuks had moved into Anatolia. They consumed part of the Byzantine Empire. Then the Ottomans came. They went all the way past Constantinople. They bypassed the capital, headed up towards the Balkans. And, you know, they pretty well swallowed the Byzantine Empire in this process, you know. Constantinople like held on until 1453. But throughout these decades, there was like a constant leakage that became a flood of the high Hellenistic culture of Byzantium into Italy. So it was like Italy was like looking to Byzantium, looking to the Hellenistic tradition for its culture, as indeed the Romans had centuries before. It's like an ongoing process. Ultimately, the pressure that the Ottomans put on the Eastern Mediterranean affected the Venetian trading rights over there. So the Venetians were coming up short. They had extensive trading in the Eastern Mediterranean. They had plantations. They had a lot of business going on there, shipping and warehousing, and they were kind of squeezed out of it. And as a result, the Venetians had to try and make up their losses by consuming more of the hinterland around Venice. And of course, that was not just free land. That was like the state of Milan and the state of Ferrara. That was in use, thank you very much. But they went to war with Ferrara. And in the Salt War, they pretty well consumed about a third of Ferrara's territory and induced massive destruction. You know, Ferrara is like built on the Po River, on a lot of marshland and a very careful cultivation of water flows. All that was gone. The fields were flooded. Villages were burned. The Ferrarese were facing famine. And in fact, it was a disaster. 1484, 1486 Salt War was a disaster. So Duke Ercole d'Este, faced with this situation, first thing he did is take out enormous loans to import enough food to keep the population from starving. That was number one task. Second task is he put on his finest clothes, took his closest advisors, and went to Venice to join in the festivities. Every year he was there for them. He turned up for them immediately after the war. The Venetians appreciated this gesture, but it must have been a hell of a bitter pill for him to swallow. But as a result of that, he was able to start rebuilding personal and diplomatic relations. And because of that, he was able to negotiate the opening of a commission to look into the causes of the war. Now, this was the thin end of the wedge that would allow him to muster the legal arguments for reparations. And eventually, it paid off. In 1491, the same date as the deck being painted, they got the first reparations for war damages paid by Venice to Ferrara. So that was a major achievement on his part. That went on for like 4 or 5 years, those negotiations. They were bitterly fought over. And we know for a fact that Sanudo was a key player in overseeing, one of 2 Venetians, patrician, overseeing the negotiations and reporting back to the Doge and the High Council of Venice. So he was a very influential figure in how the negotiations went. And shortly after the negotiations were concluded, having lived all his life as a younger son impoverished, despite being a patrician, he suddenly came into enormous wealth and built himself the largest library then known in Europe. Maps, documents, classical texts, vast library, thousands and thousands of volumes, bigger than any of the Italian dukes or even the Venetian state had. People would actually come across Europe to visit this library, as well as the other Venetian attractions. So that needs explaining a little, where all this money suddenly came from and why this traitorous figure in the trumps is holding a shield showing the date 1491. So that's a little side story. But yeah, that essentially is the background from Byzantium. We can add one little detail in as much as around 1438, 1439, as the Byzantine Empire sank into the waters, they sent like a desperate, what would you call it? It was a mixture around 300 ranking Byzantine intellectuals and the emperor and the court were sent or took themselves across to Ferrara to open a council to negotiate rejoining the Orthodox and Catholic Church. Like they kind of succeeded, but it didn't help in the end. It didn't make any difference because by then the West was exhausted in terms of running any further crusades to save the Byzantines. But the byproduct of this huge cultural meeting place in Ferrara and Florence, 1438, 1439, was that George Gemistus, also known as Platon, the age's greatest living authority on Hellenism and Plato, was set free in Ferrara and Florence. And that was a disaster for the church because for the first time in the West's history, it got the full, pure, unredacted story of Hellenism told to it. The superiority of Plato was laid out in great detail, and that included such things as the eternity of the soul's continuous process of reincarnation or metempsychosis, and the plurality of deities, and theurgy as a way of honoring these deities and being supported by them. And all of this like completely upturned the church's authority.
Such important information. I really hope the listeners appreciate it as much as I do. And yes, Peter, can you elaborate on that? Because this deck has no reference, the Solabusca deck, to Christianity. And as you mentioned, during this kind of meeting in 1438, 1439, here is this Byzantine philosopher, Platon. Can you talk about how publicly Platon would give certain lectures and talks, etc., but then privately there would be these other discussions where he would really imbue onto the kind of Western scholarship or Western elites a much more subtle and yet powerful vision of Neoplatonic thought. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, his public lectures were limited to, literally, the title was The Superiority of Plato to Aristotle. Now, it probably doesn't sound like much to us, but Aristotle underpinned Western theology. So when he comes along, and nobody can argue with this guy because he knows his Plato, he knows his Aristotle inside out. He is one of the finest intellects of the Byzantine Empire. He like just puts Aristotle in his place. And from then on, pretty well, any self-respecting Renaissance intellectual would have been pursuing Plato. Now, aside from the public lectures, we know for a fact that he wrote a short 12-point document, and it's called A Summary of the Doctrines of Zoroaster and Plato. Okay, it's reprinted in Game of Saturn as an appendix. This is the manifesto of an elite cult of Saturn. And we know that it was in circulation in the 15th century because Cardinal Bessarion had a copy of it, which he later deposited in the Venetian library, you know, when he left all his books there. So this was in circulation at the time. As I say, the document is extremely brief, 12 points, but it asserts that it takes the Chaldean oracles, which was a core operational document for the Neoplatonists. Like Neoplatonism had like two legs it stood on. One was the exegesis of Plato. The other was Theurgy. Theurgy came through Iamblichus, and especially his text on the mysteries. And so with the Chaldean oracles and Plato, you have the two legs upon which this Neoplatonic tradition was standing. And in fact, I could even go further back, that this tradition commenced in the later decades of the 4th century. And it exactly coincides with the closure of the mysteries by Theodosius. He closed down the mystery rites at the great sanctuaries of Eleusis, Samothrace, and the other places. And almost within a year or so, Plutarch of Athens opens the Academy of Plato in Athens. And that academy had two parts. One part is spoken about by everybody. It's the exegesis of the Platonic text. So you have Synesius, Proclus, Damascius, Synesius. That whole line of Neoplatonic philosophers come out of the Academy of Athens. The other side of it is almost never talked about, and it's the fact that there was an initiatory lineage. The lineage holder in that school was Asclepigenea. It was Plutarch of Athens' daughter. And she initiated and taught Proclus, Theurgy. In other words, Theurgy was an extension of the mystery cults, the initiatory mystery cults. It was not just the exegesis of Platonic texts or exegeses of exegeses and so on. We get the academic part of it today. We don't get the initiatory part of it. And it was held in a female line, interestingly. So many of the women in the Platonic Academy in Athens were also philosophy teachers. And again, that's a kind of missing dimension in Neoplatonism. Not many people register that fact today. The initiatory lineage was carried in a female line there. So this tradition continued despite the best efforts of Christian emperors like Justinian to suppress and, you know, basically persecute Hellenism. He persecuted everybody, so you know, I guess he was fairly impartial with his persecution, you know. Lots of Christians were persecuted, you know, anyone he could get his hands on. And that brings us through to Michael Pacellus in the 10th, 11th century. His circle resurrected the Chaldean oracles and the exegesis of Plato and the Platonic commentators, Proclus and the others. And finally to 15th century Byzantium. Actually, 14th century Byzantium, the chancellor of the Byzantine emperor, Demetrius Kydones, taught Plato to a small circle of insiders. Now, Kydones was the imperial chancellor. He was second only to the emperor. And he taught Gemistos Platon, Scholarius, Chrysaorus, and these people about Plato. So what you have is a Hellenistic educational system that at the summit of which, the very apex of which, is Plato. And under Plato, you get mathematics and geometry, Euclid, Pythagorean maths, because, you know, from Timaeus, the creation was based on mathematical ratios, and mathematical ratios are also musical ratios. And so all the arts and sciences depend downwards from a mystical, metaphysical summit. So the summit of education was this Platonic exegesis, and it was the common inheritance of every Byzantine scholar. Every educated person would have had this. And it was kind of ineradicable because it was the education system. If you wanted any position in the Byzantine civil service whatsoever, you would have passed through this education system. So it was baked in. So it's no surprise then that you have people like Gemistos Platon emerging in the 15th century, totally immersed in the Hellenistic worldview. And there's a very famous quote from him. One of the church fathers from the Orthodox Church was with him in Florence. And he said, I heard him there myself. He said, the world's going to be taken over, with one religion. And I said to him, who's it going to be then, Christ or Muhammad? And he said, neither of them, but one that's no different from paganism, he said. So he had a world vision, a world mission when he went to Italy. He knew the empire was lost, and he was determined to preserve the core, the esoteric core of the Hellenistic tradition by embedding it in the Italian elite, which he successfully did, if this deck is correctly interpreted.
Platon himself, as you elucidate in the book, is on one of the cards. I was shocked. Can you just kind of share about how the artist and how the actual commission itself potentially embedded actual figures, very contemporary figures, as well as the Alexandrian tradition and the Roman tradition, which we'll talk about. I was shocked looking at that and just seeing the amount of symbolism and you connecting the dots. It was fantastic.
The image, I think, is the 10 of Cups, which are like jug-like vessels. And they make a halo around a figure who's like peering through with his eyes slanted one way. What it seems has happened is that when the Byzantine delegation visited Florence, one of the artists has recorded a portrait of Platon. And it then found its way onto the walls in this massive, you go into this Florentine palace, right in the center of town. And it's got this huge stairway winding up. And the walls of the stairway are painted in a continuous, flowing pattern of figures, showing the Byzantine delegation arriving for the Council of Ferrara, Florence in 1438, 1439. And amongst them is the artist himself. And he's kind of looking at the person next to him. So the artist is pointing to somebody. And lo and behold, it's the guy dressed as a Byzantine aged figure with a long beard, because Platon was in his 80s when he came to Italy, and he's got his eyes in a particular direction. And it's exactly that portrait from that fresco in Florence, which appears to be duplicated in the Ferrara card deck. And therefore, I surmise that was possibly Platon, and the number 10 is highly significant in Pythagorean terms, as offering the key, so to speak. And Platon was spoken about by Cardinal Bessarion, a very curious figure, by the way, a cardinal in the Roman Church who had formerly been a high-up official in the Orthodox Church, but was one of Platon's closest followers and most devoted followers. You have this dissimulation of this very rich material, even at the highest levels of the Catholic Church. And in fact, the Este family maintained a cardinal for at least 300 years in the Roman Church. Most of Este cardinals were fabulously wealthy, very worldly individuals. So this is a very distinctive elite culture, nothing ascetic about it. And under Bessarion, of course, you have the growth and promotion of the Rome Academy for the study of Plato. And then you have all the strange goings on of the members of that academy deep in the catacombs of Rome at night with torches. And real suggestion they were involved in orgies down there. So, there's some real strange stuff going on at the highest levels of these societies, I have to say. Appearances apart.
No doubt. And I know we can definitely get into some of the different themes. There's certainly in the deck itself embedded sexual themes, alchemical themes. But before we get to that, Peter, we're going to get to how this is called the game of Saturn, and how Saturn is at the center of the actual deck itself. But orbiting that, there are a bunch of different themes. There is a theme running through the trump cards. There is a theme running through the court cards. There is a Babylonian theme. There is a Carthaginian theme that all orbit this kind of Saturnine engagement. Can you just kind of give listeners some of the broad strokes of these themes? Like, what was the main theme running through the trump cards versus, say, the court cards or the Alexander Romance tradition?
Over the years, I've come to conceptualize the deck in quite different ways than when I wrote the book. First of all, I'd like to say that I believe that it contains 3 ritual strands that are worth separating out. One of them is a set of operations to do with alchemy and alchemical transformation and the creation of a homunculus. That is a ritual strand embedded in the trumps. Another ritual strand is Theurgy itself, the ritual of immortalization or possession by a deity. That has its ritual cards. And the third one is what I would call a death ritual. That's to say, a ritual that reenacts the process of dying, so that one way of expressing devotion to and creating a connection with a specific deity is to reenact the death process and rejoin, so to speak, the deity, so that upon actual death, as in Plato's Phaedrus, the soul rejoins the entourage of the deity itself and is then facilitated in its rebirth into subsequent lives. And this kind of elite continuity between lives is, I would say, a third major ritual theme contained within the deck. Okay. Now, this goes a lot deeper. One of the peculiarities of the court cards is that they are all centered on the Alexander Romance literature. This is a literature which grew up even when Alexander the Great was still alive in the 4th century. It became a series of tales, tall tales and fantastic exploits of Alexander that were told by professional storytellers in Damascus, Constantinople, Cairo. And that tradition went on for years and years. Those stories were later transcribed and became a part of a European literary tradition called the Alexander Romance literature. And that remained popular well into the 17th century. So within that literature, all those tales, there's just 1 or 2 tales that are picked out. And perhaps the most important one in the court cards is the representation of all the key figures involved in Alexander's conception. Not his birth, his conception. And this is a really peculiar angle to take, because the unique factor about his conception is that his father was Amun, Amun-Ra, or Zeus Ammon, the god of Carthage. So Alexander, in his conquest of the East, identified with Ammon and even went to the Siwa oasis out in the desert to have the priests of Ammon confirm him as the son of Ammon. And this theme is picked up in the deck, which is really strange. What it does tell us is about the miscegenation, if that's the right word, between humanity and a deity. So that the suggestion is that Alexander himself is part divine and part human. And I suspect that this theme is echoed in the deck itself, in the trump cards. So there's a crossover from the court cards into the trumps. So we look at cards 20 and 21, and they depict Nimrod and Nebuchadnezzar, his spiritual son or descendant. Okay, Nimrod was one of the Nephilim, the outcome of the miscegenation between human women and the fallen angels, or the Watchers. Now, much of the Italian elite took Virgil's Aeneid, which describes how the Trojans, after the defeat of Troy in the Trojan War, left and wandered around Mediterranean, finally came to Rome and established Rome. This book, the Aeneid, took on more than literary significance for these people. It became a kind of Bible for them, as though it was actually, you know, the myth of Roman descent became an integral part of the self-representation of the Italian elite. And not only that, the Virgil's Aeneid was even used as a divinatory tool. You know, you could like open it and put your finger at a passage and read off and see what was going to happen, or ask it what the outcome of a certain event would be. It's really peculiar because today we just view it as another literary text. Okay, so what I'm suggesting now, though, is that there's a second narrative under this. Not only did the Italian elite identify themselves as the descendants of Troy, but they recognized that Troy itself had been given a very special status in ancient literature. Herodotus had talked about how people from that region, the old kingdom of Pergamon, had founded Rome. Strabo in his Geographia talks about the inhabitants of that area as the Ophiogenes, the serpent-born, and as the Azoetia, the serpent tribe. And you'll recognize the name Azoetia, of course, from Chambly's tome of that name. Okay, that's where he got it from. But a much more interesting reference comes from the 7th century Byzantine Paschal Chronicle, which describes the inhabitants of that region as the descendants of Nimrod. Okay, so now we've got this. There seems a very, very deep level in the deck. Embedded within its imagery is the suggestion that the elite are part human and part, what, spirit, deity, or... Now, this plays into another important text which arrived shortly before, and I'd like to read out the quote from it if I could just find it for you. What had happened is that around 1460, Cosimo de' Medici, who had attended Platon's talks when he was in Florence, sponsored Marsilio Ficino, the great Renaissance scholar, to translate all the works of Plato. And he set off on that task. And then in 1463, Cosimo de' Medici received a copy of the Hermetica. And such was the historical value that he placed on this. It was thought of as like a text right from the very beginning of time. So he told Ficino to stop his translation of Plato and concentrate on the Hermetica because he needed to be able, or wanted to be able to read it before he died. The text here that kind of they would have discovered when they did the translation of the Hermetica, specifically of Asclepius, is this: "What a great miracle man is, Asclepius, a being worthy of reverence and honor. He passes into the nature of a god as though he were himself a god. He understands the race of daemons because he originates from the same source. He despises that part of his nature which is only human, for he has put his hope in the divinity of the other part." And they would have read this as gospel because it's coming from their perspective from the oldest spiritual tradition to which humanity had access, the Hermetica. And this is from Asclepius, A Secret Discourse of Hermes Trismegistus, part 6, if anyone needs to look it up. So around 1463, this concept was well and truly launched. And that's what I see echoed in the deck in the terms of the two cards, Nimrod and Nebuchadnezzar, and in the divinity of Alexander as the son of Ammon. Ammon, of course, is the Egyptian and North African name for Kronos of the Greeks, or Saturn as the Romans called him. And I just want to caution people on one aspect of this, not to mix up this deity with the planetary intelligence. That's separate. That's a lower octave by far. We're talking about one of the kind of supreme creative beings here.
There are so many references, as you mentioned and intimated before, to Gnosticism and this kind of ability to liberate oneself and go beyond the archons that control the world and unite the soul with the beings in the pleroma, etc., as kind of a way of escaping the world. And then you have in this deck kind of the inverse of that, where you have people who are implementing specific rituals within the deck to embed themselves within this kind of Malkuthian plane in order fully aware of the way things are set up, but choosing instead to remain within the current stream of the demiurge. Now, there's a lot of different themes that are playing there, and I know that there's, new information that you have as well. Can you just kind of share with listeners about what are the main themes when it comes to Gnosticism, voluntary possession, and materiality?
Initially, when I wrote the book, I found that the Gnostic lens, let's call it, as an interpretive lens, was the most fruitful one to try and make sense of this material. But as the time has passed, And I've seen more deeply into the Hellenistic roots, not only of Platon himself, but of that tradition. I've come to see that what Platon was actually doing in his 12 points is entirely bypassing the history and theology of Christianity. For Platon, they didn't exist. So his starting place is like 8th century BCE Hesiod's theogony. And that's like ground zero for him. And in there, it describes how Zeus and the Olympians come along. They have a battle with Kronos and the Titans, the ancient gods. They overcome them, and then they place the ancient gods in the underworld. They become Tartarian, but they also are the controllers of the material realm. So it's not like a million miles away from Gnosticism, but it doesn't have the aspect of good and evil. It doesn't have the aspect of sin. Materiality is not sinful in this model, okay? Like if you look at the Cathars and so on, it's almost like there's a distaste for materiality. So Platon is far more purely Hellenistic in this respect. I'm shifting my interpretative lens now more to accommodate that, because that's where I think the cards came from, rather than from a later Gnostic dualism between good and evil. I don't see that anymore in the deck. That's not a fruitful way to think about it. And again, if you'll only go and reconsider the 12 points that Platon wrote as a summary of his elite system, you'll say that he says all the gods are good. They're incapable of evil, okay? They are just fully themselves in their particular spheres of influence. And as far as the material sphere goes, as far as people are concerned, the deity who has suzerainty is Kronos, or Saturn, okay? He's the god of this world, the Mundus Rex. There's nothing evil about this, but he's the right spiritual authority for all matters to do with humanity and material concerns. That doesn't mean you shouldn't aspire to have some higher mystical union with some other deity, okay? It doesn't cancel that. But it means that your spiritual path will be determined a lot about your particular circumstances, okay? And if those circumstances involve being born into an elite Renaissance family in the 15th century, your spiritual path is going to be really different from one we would recognize as a spiritual path today. You're going to, first of all, have incredible levels of responsibility. You're going to have relatives. I mean, Nicole d'Este had children from 12 separate women. So talk about claimants. You know, so it's not just like you have to look around the borders of your realm. You know, the poison could be in your cup already. Your spiritual path in this kind of situation is going to be far closer to what we see with the samurai, the Bushido, who were living in a similar medieval time frame in which there was incessant war, rival claimants, and the elite armies that supported them, you know. So it was kind of unstoppable momentum of history. And if you're like caught up in that path, you have to define your spirituality accordingly. And in fact, when we look back at Plato, you know, one of the big issues for subsequent exegesis of Plato is what is the correct order to read the dialogues? The general agreement was you start with Alcibiades because he is the young man who's getting started in the political life and needs to learn what's the priorities in order to be of service. And then the rest of the dialogues open out that concept of service. So rather than this like mystical escape into some infinitude that many people have as their like dream or think of as an ideal, here you have an aspiration towards higher levels of service because you cannot unplug from your responsibilities in the here and now. They are overwhelming. And if you fail in your responsibilities, you'll see your family get wiped out, possibly. So it's a very different context within which we have to frame spirituality. And Platon, is often thought of as this saintly guy, but he was an advisor to the emperor and his son, who was the despot of Morea. And he said to them, oft times, the surgeon has to cut for the patient to survive. These are harsh times. 15th century was a period of incessant warfare. We talked about the Salt War, but in fact, every single year, Ercole d'Este was in the saddle with the army on the front lines. It's another world, really.
It really is. And it's just fascinating perusing and considering the different cards and considering the context that you put into the book. And I guess that brings up a question, Peter. When the book first came out, you mentioned that the deck's creation utilized this kind of cosmology of predation. And it was a very cutthroat, very intense time in Italy in the 1400s. Now that there's this new lens that you've mentioned, where instead of there's this kind of false dichotomy that it's actually bypassing Christianity completely, does that change how you perceive the cosmology of predation at all? Or is that cosmology of predation and the Saturnine rituals still very, very central to the deck?
Yeah, it's absolutely central. Why? Because in this age, magic was pervasive at every level of society, from the top to the bottom. And we know for a fact that Ercole d'Este and the other rulers maintained what is called the clerical underworld. Okay, these are priests, monks, clerical students who specialize in ritual magic, which would be Goetic, essentially, or Solomonic. Okay, the parish priest and chief exorcist of Modena, which was the town from which the d'Este had the original titles. It was their town. The parish priest there, William Campana, or William Bell, his name was hauled in front of inquisitors on a number of occasions. So we have a pretty good idea of his activities. And he was an out-and-out sorcerer. And every time he was hauled in front of the Inquisition, stripped of his priesthood, stripped of his titles and everything, he'd immediately be reinstituted. So the elite kept these priests and monks and clerics, these sorcerers, going and protected them from the Inquisition. The only reason they did that is they had use of them. The use of magic, both maleficium, or attack sorcery, essentially, as well as protective or talismanic, apotropaic magic, was integral to the elite functioning, as well as it was for all the merchants and the shop owners and even the peasantry at the bottom, So this framework then is the given ethnographic social context within which we're operating. You need to do this stuff to protect yourself and to fight back. And what Platon was bringing was a higher order of magic to this. So it was like the apex or capstone on a vast system of magic beneath. And the magic, let's make no bones about it, it is possession by the fiercest form of Amon, the dragon serpent. That's the energy. It's an unbearable, heated energy. And it was precisely to empower the ruler to rule in such a way as to always be successful. And Ercole d'Este ruled for like 30 years. So maybe it worked.
Yeah, to rule for 30 years in that kind of historical environment is an incredible feat in and of itself, for sure. And Peter, so when it comes to how to actually achieve that ritualistic possession of the deity, how did you go about tracing the rituals in the deck? Because the way you lay out the cards and the context that you provide around them, I was blown away. I mean, there's a card that intimates opening rites. There's a card for covering one of your eyes with one of your hands. There's a card about placing materia on a brazier. There's a card about the implied sacrifice of child immolation. And then there's a card about being possessed by the deity themselves. And then there's a card about drawing down the moon. I mean, when you were going through this, was this a sudden revelation where you said, oh my gosh, here is an actual thread that is consistent? Or were you putting the pieces together meticulously and then put them all together at one point? Or how is this? Because this is just incredible to read.
There's a certain lens for looking at imagery which is focused in on posture and gesture, you know. I have that sensitivity to it. And as we laid out at the beginning, I had to accept that every detail was significant. There was nothing accidental in there, and that there was a polysemous narrative going on. Okay, so posture and gesture suggested themselves because they're so prominent in the deck as being meaningful in their own right. Right, I then had to work out in what sense they were meaningful. Now, because I have an interest, for instance, in Dionysus, in Minoan art, I know for a fact that certainly the gesture of the hand in front of the face is one that features in Minoan ritual art. And when you think about it, ritual, like dance, is a performative element that doesn't really evolve in time. Okay, because it's performative, it's emulated. It isn't, so to speak, modified because it has a sacred character. So the ritual gestures that we've been able to recognize in very early art, like Minoan art or Babylonian art, recur in the Mediterranean basin. So this was one key insight. So when I saw that the artist had gone to the trouble of giving that particular figure a peaked hat so that you could see that the left hand had crossed over to cover the right eye, I knew it was not accidental. It had to be signaling something. And I was able to identify this gesture. In Greek terms, it's called aposkopein. It is the ritual gesture of greeting to a deity, to bring the hand in front of the face. The fact that it was covering the right eye, closing it, and therefore leaving the left eye open was highly significant, because I knew from Plato that the left is devoted to the chthonic and the right to the celestial. So covering the right eye and leaving the left eye open is suggestive of that ritual, to say that I close my eyes to the celestial gods. I open my inner sight to the chthonic gods. And then when I looked at the configuration of the legs, again, you know, it's taken details seriously. The devil is in the detail. This is a Renaissance master engraver. If those legs look funny, they're meant to look funny. They're telling you something, right? They're not just accidental. And the particular configuration is curtsying. That's the only time you ever see someone's legs in that configuration. And curtsying is another ritual act. It's not something you do normally, generally. Can't remember last time I curtsied to anyone. So I knew that that was an important ritual activity going on there. You only curtsy to a higher level entity or being. So the third element, and remember, we can also look at this card in its pre-painted version. There are pre-painted prints of many of the cards available, okay? So you can have a clear line drawing of exactly what was it. That is a brazier on the floor. It's standard form of brazier. And on the painted card, you can see he's given it a kind of reddish coal effect. And he's placing herbs on it. So this is like a classic ritual, you know. You're greeting the god, you're welcoming, you're courtesying, that's to say moving vertically instead of bending forward into the deity's space. And you're placing herbs on a burner ready for the incense to arise. I mean, all of these are recognizable ritual elements today. There's no mystery there. It requires that you take every detail seriously and think about it and how it would work. The far more interesting one was the drawing down the moon. What I hadn't realized is that ritual is attested as early as 7th, 8th century BCE, which is amazing. It's clearly referenced in Greek drama from 4th century BC. And it's still practiced today by Wiccans and in witchcraft circles. It's never changed. Now, because the Chaldean oracles is such a key text in this kind of theurgic practice, we know that the moon, the waning moon, never practiced theurgy during a waning moon, it says. Why? Because In the Chaldean oracles, like Hecate or Hera in Platon's system, is the moon. But the dark side of her is called Physis. And Physis controls the lower entities and beings, and they're very active during the waning moon. So they're perfect for rites of materialization. And the Mithraic ritual liturgy warns the practitioner, saying never try to practice theurgic ascent during a waning moon, because she's too active and all those beings are too active. They'll block you. So the fact that this figure is holding a spinning top, which is recognizably one of the toys of Dionysus. See my book about Dionysian initiation, Mistai. We'll come to that, right? He's holding a spinning top, which is open, and in the core of which is a small trail of smoke coming out. So there again, you have the offering, you have a hollow vessel, you have a waning moon, and this beard is descending into it. Now, this business in the deck, it's a tiny feature of the iconography, whereby one of the figures either grips his beard or has the beard going into something. This gripping the beard and the iconographic significance of the beard in Western iconography is that it is an allusion to masturbation. That means that the hollow vessel he's offering to the moon contains sperm and possibly mensae as well. And that mixture is now going to be animated by the planetary entities and their energies that he has summoned and which are now being funneled through the moon. Physis, the moon, is the mediatrix of the planetary entities. So by timing the right, he gets a certain configuration of energies active and then channels them through the waning moon into a physical medium, which becomes talismanic. And in Renaissance thought, sperm would be thought of as small people. With appropriate alchemical operations, you could generate homunculus from sperm. Okay, so he is setting up the sacrificial victims with this rite. Later on, you're going to see the baby held over the fire. Actually, what they would have done is deposit the sexual fluids into the flame as an offering to the deity to complete the theurgic rite with an appropriate offering. They didn't have to sacrifice babies, in other words. Which, you know, in a Renaissance situation would have been very difficult since they all lived on top of each other in about 2 or 3 rooms. You know, there was no privacy ever.
That would have been a pretty difficult feat to pull off at that time.
So anyway, this is how I went about the ritual deconstruction of the deck's imagery. Looked at this way, it's systematic, it's solid, it's all based on known stuff from Chaldean oracles, from modern ritual practice, or from ancient art. You know, you just need to bring together the elements to make sense of it.
Just to give listeners a sense who haven't seen the deck yet or picked up a copy of the book yet, Peter, one of the most subtle cards to me as well, I mean, there's so many examples, is the one that alludes to Helen of Troy sitting in a chair. And you can just see, and I didn't even pick up on this until you shared it in the book, you can just see the faintest vine descending behind her, and kind of right before it gets to her chair, it kind of almost forms a kind of noose shape, but it's disguised in this vine. And then you provided this amazing context about her death and how this is in the card and how it links back to the other themes. I mean, I was blown away. It was amazing.
There's some parts of this imagery which are still very elusive. I mean, we can say this is sourced from this particular classical text, for instance. Okay, but what's the significance? Why did the artist put it there? What was the intent? That's the problem we have with it. There's some parts of this imagery which we understand on a kind of literary level, but their deeper significance is what I suspect is being alluded to here is the commonality between her maiden name as Polysena and the Polysena who was sacrificed in the Iliad, I believe, Homer's Iliad. So that again, this theme of continuous rebirth within certain family lineages is continuously referenced in these like obscure ways. You know, you need to have a real kind of literary feel for the types of texts that would have been available to those people. they had access to far less text than we do by a huge factor, but they knew them inside out. Whereas today we're kind of overwhelmed with texts, but we can't really say we know any of them inside out. Standard education in that period, in the Renaissance, would be to memorize huge chunks of Virgil's Aeneid. You just know it by heart. It would be like one of 2 or 3 books that you studied. And there's no way today to achieve that feat, So, yeah, I don't know if that explains it a little, but it looks like a reference once more to the metapsychosis and the continuity of certain bloodlines, generation after generation, to such an extent that they even repeat their names and the physical characteristics and outcomes that they experienced in the past.
Absolutely. And to that point, Peter, we do have a few listener questions as well. And this kind of ties into astrology and constellations and the malefic stars specifically that you mentioned a few moments ago at the beginning of the chat. We have a listener question from Kevin Carlo who's asking, could Peter perhaps do a deep dive on the star Algol and its importance to the Sola Busca deck? And this star, as you pointed out, it's right on one of the trump cards, and it's right on and depicted and described in the game of Saturn. Can you share about this?
Let me attempt to do so. The perspective on Algol has changed somewhat over the years, as you might imagine. My initial perspective on Algol, there's like 2 discourses about it. And the one that I had chanced upon is the one that deemed it an evil thing. So that, for instance, if you do an act of sorcery, you can draw down the energies of Algol to fix the intent in place. And this typically is how a fixed or Bahamian star would be used in an act of sorcery. Since that time, I've become aware that Algol, which is the head of the Medusa, and her real head in myth, became part of the shield, Athena's shield, so that she bore a shield on which the face of the Medusa appeared. And in that role, it becomes an apotropaic symbol. In other words, it's a good way of defending against evil. So this is an amplification of what I had said in the book. So there's like a duality in regard to Algol. It is always one of the fixed stars. It always can be used to fix intent, but intent can vary. It could be malicious intent or it could be protective. That's the way I'm reading it now, and I hope that's a more helpful framework to view it in.
Absolutely. And in terms of that kind of broader discussion, Peter, about astrological influences, spirit influences, we do have a listener question from Ted Orville, and Ted is asking and saying, while it's tempting to separate spirit conjuration methodologies from more astral magic approaches, like the Key of Solomon versus the Picatrix, for example, do you, Peter, see a synthesis of these traditions in this example of stellar spirit theurgy, like Algol plus the archonic entities?
I think we dealt with the evil archonic lens already. We kind of discarded that as a fruitful framework for viewing the deck.
Right.
But we definitely do see a synergy of planetary and stellar magic, which are heavily used, certainly in the creation of the homunculus. And the output of that ritual process feeds into the theurgic ritual. As I said, so the same energized sexual fluids turn up in the theurgic ritual as the sacrificial matter in order to induce possession of the figure, which is depicted on that strange, bizarre card with the monk with the dragon wings and the golden band across his head. I think that is a symbol of enlightened mindset consequent upon possession by the deity. Certainly, Iamblichus was described in the lives of the sophists and philosophers, very early text, I think, by Eunapius, as emitting a golden glow when he meditated and of levitating off the ground. So this idea that when you're possessed by an entity or being, it energizes your energy body in such a way that it's visible to other people. the thing is captured in that very discreet way by putting a golden band and these large dragon wings on his back. And I say, since we've now moved beyond the Christian dichotomy, we don't have to start thinking about devil and evil and stuff. The dragon is the proper zoomorphic form of Saturn Kronos. Always was from the earliest days, and it continues. It's not an element from Christian iconography that we're looking at. It's Hellenistic through and through. But it's bizarre that they place that figure in a monk's dress, whereas most of the other figures in the deck are like in armor. I mean, they're martial. So again, something else is being signaled here. It's like saying, no, this stuff, this moment of theurgic possession is happening on a higher plane than the martial stuff. The ritual stuff is all with armored or armed individuals. Now the monk is without armor and without arms. His head is like golden, you know. He's got the dragon wings of full possession, and he's looking at a figure, kind of representation of the deity with wings directly on the head. And I think the quote I put in the book kind of summarizes that. It's a known figure from theurgic ritual activity.
One of the things I found absolutely fascinating, among many things about the book, is we have many listeners who are practitioners of ceremonial magic and are very familiar with nomina magica, barbarous names of power, things like that you might find in not only the PGM, but the Western grimoires, etc. One of the things that you suggested that I found fascinating is perhaps the names themselves, like the name of that very card that you mentioned about the ritualistic possession of the deity, could in fact themselves be encoded nomina magica that would be vocalized or vibrated during the ritual. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and this is a job for somebody, for somebody else. Basically, there was a system of Roman encoding called sigla, and you can check it up on the internet, but basically it takes first, second, or first, middle, and last letters of any Latin word and puts them together. Now, if you take the titles of certain of the trumps, like Ipeo, and you add the Latin numerals and read them as a string, as though they're all letters, okay, not numerals anymore, they're all letters, you'll have a string which is an anagram. And then by applying the rules of sigla, you can extract from the anagram. I have a paper on this. It's not published. This idea was given to me by somebody on the Tarot History Forum, actually. It's a wonderful idea, but I've not seen it pursued by anybody. It's never been printed. I worked some examples. They're not in the book, unfortunately. I did them after the book was available. But it needs somebody with a better grasp of Latin than me, and somebody with a good grasp of ritual. But there's the possibility that stringing the name and the number together as a series of letters and then chopping them round like you would do with an anagram, you can extract a series of sigla codes, which are summary words, and then you expand each of the words. That may well be a hidden portion of the deck's meaning still. There's some good stuff to still be dug into in this deck.
Indeed. I think in addition to just a wonderful scholarly presentation and incredible research and connecting the dots, I definitely come away with that too, that you're kind of inviting people that when it comes to many of the other cards in the deck and when it comes to the other themes, that there really is a lot that scratches the surface. And that's actually hard to believe after reading your book, because I was overwhelmed with the amount of connections and just the amount of context that was added on to that. It was great.
It's a masterwork in terms of its design, in terms of the economical employment of a vast range of sources. So, initially when we talk about this polysemy, the different layers on which the thing is constructed. And because of that layering process, so that, we have a historical layer, we have the ritual layer, we have metaphysics, we have, a lot of strange occult lore has been embodied in this deck, layer upon layer. It requires a lot of careful work to disentangle it. And as you say, we're not done yet. It's
yes,
I invite people to come in and help,
And I absolutely would encourage listeners, hey, definitely not only pick up a copy of A Game of Saturn, but please, try and connect the dots yourself as well to build on what you've shared, Peter. Speaking of some of the themes that you've already touched on, we do have a couple listener questions. We have a listener question from Maria who's saying, hi, Peter, I practice planetary ceremonial magic, and I wanted to know if you could elaborate on the planetary themes in the deck. For example, I was surprised, Maria says, to see Physis in the deck versus Hecate. And you've touched on that before, Peter, but can you just share about the planetary themes? I mean, there is a card that intimates Saturnine energies. There's a card that intimates martial energies, Mercury even. Can you just share about that?
It's as simple as what you said. You know, the Mercury card is the Chthonian Mercury, the guide of the dead is represented there. The Saturn figure, we know it's Saturn because he's holding a T-shaped object in his hand, okay? And that is a foliot. It is not a weighing device, as some people have said. It is not a scales. If it was scales, you'd have little cups suspended from each of the two arms. They're not there. Instead, it has two weights. And a foliot is a characteristic device in Renaissance timepieces. It's actually a rocking device that lets the spring uncoil in a regular way rather than, in an uneven fashion. We know it's a symbol of Saturn because it appears on the walls of a villa in Trento. There's a figure representing Saturn, and he has a huge foliot on his back to signal to anyone looking at the image, this is a representation of Saturn. Okay, so this is another correction to current reading. Its accuracy. The figure doesn't look like scales for a reason. It's not, you can't just say, oh, well, it's like scales, it's scales. That's not good enough. This is precise, high levels of precision every time. It's a foliot. And you have to know that in order to be able to read it, okay? The other figure you mentioned, Mars, an easy one, really, Marius. He's all in red. He's a very famous and brutal warlord. If ever there was an embodiment of Mars, Gaius Marius was it. So these are kind of easy peasy bits to tease out of the deck. The constellations are a little more difficult, not much, but it really gets more sophisticated with the metaphysics, I would say. I don't know if that helps answer her question, but they're all pretty malefic planetary and stellar influences. If you're not caught up in the Christian thing, good and evil, you're just recognizing these are the forces you need if you're defending a state. You've got to have these guys watching your back. None better.
Absolutely, yeah. What I really appreciate, in addition to many things, is kind of laying the groundwork and putting things in context. And to that point too, Peter, we do have a listener question, and this touches on the themes of homoeroticism, of sexual magic from Roy. And Roy says, Peter, can you talk about the sexual magic and alchemy in the deck, not counting modern tarot decks? Is this, Peter, this kind of focus on sexual imagery unique in tarot or Tarocchi?
Yeah, it's absolutely unique as far as I know. There wouldn't be a deck of cards like this, I think, until Crowley had the Thoth deck drawn, which is equally informed by a very rich ritual practice. So, yeah, it's really unique. Again, the sexual imagery, the Ace of Swords is one of the cards I point to. Why? Because the hilt of the sword is like a phallus. There's a figure like reaching around, and he's holding a lock of hair, which is always a Renaissance indication of Ocasio or Tempus, the spirit of opportunity. So it signals the right or right time, which is, of course, a key aspect in any ritual process. So the extraction of semen is indicated in that card. There's another one showing Alexander killing the fabled basilisk, which is one of the stories from the Alexander Romance literature. The basilisk occurs throughout ancient literature, from Pliny's natural history through to the 17th century magical texts, as the source of the blood of Saturn. The blood of the basilisk is the blood of Saturn, and it's menses that they're talking about as an ingredient in magical operations. We talked about the significance of the beard, of pulling the beard, of the beard being immersed as a pointer towards this kind of sexual activity or the use of sexual fluids. Covered that. There's one very, very curious aspect of this deck I'm going to touch on for nearly the first time ever. It was actually pointed out to me by Jocelyn Godwin, and when I checked, he was spot on. We talked earlier about there's two coats of arms in the deck, illustrated, right? The Venier and the Sonudo. The Venier arms are 3 red bands interspersed with silver. Okay, so kind of you can see them fairly clearly even today. And the coat of arms has a gold band across it, a diagonal band from left to right. Now, if you have the cards or you have a high definition image, you zoom in and in and in into the corner, and you'll see the gold band terminates in a phallus ending. And that phallus ending goes into the mouth of a demon.
Wow. My mind's blown right now. That is incredible.
On each of the Venier cards. This is like first time we're making this public, I think.
Wow. Peter, this is incredible. What was going through your mind when you, adding in the game of Saturn, you are sharing with the world really an incredible amount of context. What were some of the first things crossing your mind when you heard that?
Well, earlier we talked about the miscegenation as a theme, whether it's the descent of Nimrod from the intercourse of women with angels. When you think about it, the story of the Watchers is the story of the birth of the alchemical and magical traditions themselves, because all of those sciences are handed as part of that process. Now, what seems to be implied here, and let me give you another source, because at the earliest text of alchemy we have Zosimus of Panopolis, right? He describes how a woman, and he's kind of criticizing her, saying this is not a good way to go. It's not a healthy way to go. He's saying she's laying herself open to attract an angel down to have intercourse with her, but she won't let him do so until he gives certain secrets of an alchemical nature. There's a very curious dark thread running through magic of the intercourse between humans and non-human entities. Like the low level of this is like the succubus incubus, which strangely enough we come across quite a bit in energy healing. It's a form of predation. It's a form of parasitic predation. And what these authorities seem to be suggesting is that it's possible to utilize this mechanism, if that's a good word for it, to extract information of a magical or alchemical nature that you couldn't get access to otherwise, because it's held by the jinn or the other beings. This introduces for most people a very dark thread in the history of magic, this intercourse of men and women with entities who are able to assume the corresponding shape of a man or a woman, and who can be entered into a relationship with for the extraction of knowledge. But essentially, that is the tradition, like it or not, of the birth of those traditions, That is, the story of the Watchers. So there's something of that echoed in this strange act of demonic fellatio, this intercourse between different orders of being.
No detail, as you say, is unintentional.
And no detail is too small. Sometimes the smallest details have enormous metaphysical import. Like the vine that looks like a rope going around her neck, it's easy to dismiss it initially, but then why is it there, Again, if you go back to the ethnography of Renaissance art practice, how this thing was created, it's coming from the highest, deepest levels. of learning. We haven't talked about who the designer was yet, but, that is significant input to understand.
I mean, this might amplify the speculation and the new information in the book, but we do have a listener question from Mark Edward Hendricks, who's saying, I have not yet read The Game of Saturn, so please forgive me if this is addressed within its pages, but Mark says, I'm curious as to what you, Peter, may speculate regarding the possibility that the invisible elite of today are directly descended, not necessarily by blood, from those quote-unquote black nobility, Ferraris and the Venetians who are the subject of your book. Like, is there anything that you can say how it links into modern times?
Not really. I mean, I'm as puzzled as anyone else is by this. Well, I would note one thing, that the House of Este is a Central European elite lineage. The Italian House of d'Este were a cadet branch, and one of their descendants, Mary of Modena, Mary d'Este, married, I think, James VI, and she was briefly Queen of England, which is a fairly significant thing for a undistinguished, Italian woman. She was Queen of England. Wow. The other branch, cadet branch of the House of Este, of course, are the Hanoverian monarchs. So we're talking George I, II, III, we're talking American War of Independence, all of that good stuff. And there's another surprising link. And then I kind of spin off with everyone else. How is it that from the 45 now American presidents, at least 43 of them are directly connected to King John of England from the 12th or 13th century? How is that even possible? And then, you look at the previous generation of American politicians, Obama, Bush, Cheney, John Kerry, and you realize they're all like cousins of each other. This is just so far out, isn't it? It's just like, what? So I'm as puzzled as anyone else. From a Platonic perspective, the mechanism is laid out in Plato's Phaedrus. And there he's quite clear, the theurgic death ritual, in which the theurgist would actually have themselves buried up to the head so that they could fully let go of all materiality, was a way of connecting with the deity and ensuring subsequent rebirths. This is a concept. I was talking to Mark Stavish a couple of weeks ago, and he said, it's normal in his family coming from Central Europe. His grandmother was always saying, I'm going to reincarnate in such and such. So again, ethnography, the fact that this concept of a family lineage and of rebirth into that lineage again and again and again is very widely held. It comes as a shock to the more intellectuals members around, because we don't think in those terms. We have a model of consciousness and reality which doesn't admit that. But in far more traditional societies and cultures, that is the norm, and they often undertake rituals to encourage that process, to make sure it happens. So again, the ethnography is important here to get a correct perspective on what's being said in the deck.
Speaking of the ethnographic record, we do have another question, Peter, from Ted Orville, who's saying that there are other famous pictorial artifacts from the same family, the d'Este family in the city of Ferrara. The stunning Palazzo Schifanoia with Olympian gods, decanic images, and the family embedded together in descending rings. The d'Este contributions aside, Ted is asking, Peter, are there other examples of this kind of interplay or use of this model? And I know this is your area of expertise for sure.
Gosh, I wish I could think of snap back with examples, but the Palazzo Schifanoia is essentially a talisman, okay? It has the Olympian deities, then it has the decans for each month of the year, and the position of the sun and moon within the fresco cycle serves to lock in a certain date at which Duke Borso d'Este was raised to the dukedom. So it was a very fortunate date astrologically because he arranged for his inauguration on a specific date. Court astrologers would work that out. And then they kept a careful record of these events, like his birth and which planets were ascending, because astrological charts were done on a daily basis. Right at the start of business of each day, the Duke would sit down with the astrologer and say, okay, for these planetary hours during the day, what we should or shouldn't be doing, and, for this week as well. And then all the court procedure would be organized around that. Okay, it was a totally magical worldview in that respect. So when they painted the Palazzo Schifanoia frescoes, they elected to lock in a particular configuration of the stars and planets in the fresco cycle, so that in effect it froze in place a certain number of energies, just like a talisman. Exactly, it was a talisman actually, rather than a decorative scheme. And then it pours those energies down into each month of the year, where they depict the court going about its typical business from month to month. This cycle was designed, and the project was supervised day to day by Pellegrino Prisciani, his name was. He was the court astrologer for the d'Este family under Borso d'Este and then Ercole d'Este. He was a polymath, a Renaissance polymath. He designed the entirety of this fresco cycle, and he gave daily advice on astral magic, essentially, to the court members. He was also a professor of mathematics, a Hebraist, a magistrate, a diplomat, historian, and he was the lead, of course, when they came to the successful negotiations with Venice for reparations. He was the one who went into the archives, dug out all the old treaties and agreements, and the Venetians had to put up with his arguments. He eventually won. So this is a phenomenal figure in the court life of Ferrara who designed that. Now, there's not another work of art in Ferrara like that, because it was struck by massive earthquakes on a number of occasions. Although they had vast meters and meters of frescoed walls, a lot of it is lost now. We have some paintings. One of them is of interest. It's a puzzle to the curators of the National Gallery in London, but it shows a woman. When I read it, it's quite clear who it is. It's Saturnia, Saturn's daughter, straight from Virgil's Aeneid. So she's depicted there. This was for the private studiolo, or, private meditation and reading space, the studiolo in the Renaissance, because there was no privacy otherwise. I mean, there's hundreds of people, dogs and cats, and, very few doors. It was just like everything was done in plain sight. That's the only other work of art which I would describe as remotely talismanic. The way it's depicted, is very impressive, like you're looking up at this deity. So clearly that particular figure was important to them. There's nothing like this deck of cards in Renaissance art that I'm aware of. And the nearest thing I can think of, I alluded to earlier, of this multi-level Neoplatonic kind of thought comes with Botticelli. There are certainly rooms in the Medici Palace in Florence, which I missed when I was last there. I'll go to next time I get a chance to travel, which have a kind of the birth of Saturn and a huge wall painting, all concerned with Saturn. And I'm thinking of making a bit of an investigation of that. That could be very fruitful. But to be honest, the problem is that although these works of art are all well documented, well known, written about for 100 years, 200 years, nobody has looked at them from a ritual perspective. They're like, okay, we've done that, and it isn't really done. We haven't really scratched the surface of viewing art from a ritual perspective. The game of Saturn is just like the opening curtain, I hope, of a new interpretive school.
Absolutely. And that kind of leads to this kind of question of ritual and the importance of something that I love that you elucidated on this, Peter, in your book, was the use of intersubjectivity. I love your description of ritual and really pushing the boundaries of liminality, because I know in the ceremonial magic community, for lack of a better phrase, there's a lot of discussion about spiritual entities and are they subjective or are they objective? And Crowley interpreted them this way, as portions of the human brain. And no, they're objective beings, but they filter through a subjective mesh of your five senses, etc. And then reading your amazing use of the term intersubjectivity in ritual. Can you share with the listeners about what is intersubjectivity and how does it contrast to objectivity and subjectivity?
Yeah, sure. It's a great question, actually, because it's like at the very core of the ritual question and the magical question as well. It's important to distinguish social aspects of ritual from what I call highly intensive forms of ritual. Intensive forms of ritual are undertaken specifically to generate ritual space as a new and separate entity. Now, let's take it gently. Anyone can go along to family constellation therapy, right? What happens is you go along there, you've got some family issues you want to resolve. You're in a room with complete strangers. You select, okay, you represent my father, my mother, my brother, sister, whatever. You place those people in the middle of a space. And then you sit down and watch. And what those people will experience all of a sudden is the formation of an energy field and an emotional overlay, which is not their own. So they're perfectly aware of being themselves, but they suddenly have access to information and an emotional tone which has nothing to do with them. So you can then interrogate this space, find where the emotional disturbances are, and reharmonize the space. Okay, so anyone can go along and experience this. This space, the fact that these people, without knowing who you are, can access your family and your ancestral inheritance, your karma, literally, and activate it in the present time, correct it in the present time, and then return the space harmonized. And it relieves you of symptoms in the present time, is a use of intersubjectivity in space. The one academic who's written extensively about this is Jose Gil. He's an anthropologist. He was the research assistant for Gilles Deleuze, very famous French philosopher. He talks about the exfoliation of space, and his particular context is dance. And he says during a performance, a dancer can exfoliate a space around them, which changes the way in which time flows. Okay? And I would recommend anyone his essay, Paradoxical Body. It's in the Drama Review, 2006, volume 50, number 4. It's an excellent essay about it. Another excellent resource on this is an essay by W.E. Butler. I don't know whether your listeners know about him, but he was one of the great mages in the British magical tradition, in the Servants of the Light and Dion Fortune and all of that group in the 30s and 40s. And he's written an essay. It's a seminal essay on this subject. It's called The Egregore of a School. Okay, you can just download that. And in that, he talks about the creation of a ritual space as an egregore, as almost a being in its own right, and the dangers of that. And this theme is picked up in the one book that I know about that's ever been focused on this topic. It's Mark Stavish's book called Egregores. And that's like the classic work. He's drawn together most of the important textual sources in there and summarized them very nicely. So let's move forward a little bit. There's a great example of the ritual space. There was an anthropologist, his name was Bruce Grindle, and he's written a paper, Into the Heart of Sisala Experience, Witnessing Death Divination. It's the Journal of Anthropological Research, volume 39, 1983. In that, he was not invited into this divinatory ritual in West Africa, I think. He snuck in. And what they were doing is the king's sacred drummer had just died unaccountably. And they wanted to learn whether there was anything amiss about this. So the sacred dancers started a ritual dance, you know. And he says, as he's watching this, he can feel the energy rising up his spine, you know. And it kind of reaches his head and it explodes in this huge light. Oh, this is a classic Kundalini. Energy rising, you know. This is one of the effects of intense ritual space on our own physiology. It tends to activate the Kundalini. When this Kundalini exploded in his head, he looked out and he could see these incredible streams of light coming from the hands of the ritual dancers and playing over the body of the king's dead drummer. And then the drummer got up off the bar and started dancing and playing the drums like this corpse was like wheeling around Now, this is all in a real straight academic journal of anthropology, right? And everyone in anthropology interested in rituals probably read this essay. Nobody comments about it. The problem is, what was he seeing? Okay. In what sense did the dead drummer get up and start dancing and drumming furiously, right? Well, in an intersubjective or ritual space. For a totally objective observer outside, he probably wouldn't see anything but the dancers. Okay. But for the ritualists attuned to it, they see the whole ritual. And this very much goes towards what we read in like Carlos Castaneda, especially the early books. There are certain states of consciousness connected with ritual space that manifest as another reality. Okay, I hope this helps clarify it. So these three sources I've given, Gill, Stavish, Bruce Grindle, can go a long way to clarifying it. I also have a paper on myacademia.edu, which is Ritual as Therapy. Steps towards an Anthropology of the Invisible, I think is subtitle. But Ritual as Therapy also deals with this generation of ritual space and intersubjectivity. On the larger issue on the objectivity or otherwise of entities and beings, I can say from my own experience, because I have a kind of sight to some extent, that they're totally external, they're other dimensional, but they're normally filtered through a lens, which is either ritually generated, or in some cases, they are able to draw upon imagery within your own consciousness in order to clothe themselves. You're seldom seeing them as is, so to speak. And normally an other dimensional entity is vibrating at such a rate anyway, you couldn't make sense of it. So it needs like a transposition process, which ritual space provides, or in some case they provide themselves. I can give you an example of that. I've given it before on other podcasts, if you're interested. It's interesting that, you know, it's documented in the anthropological journals as well. I've spoken to a lot of anthropologists, and they've had these experiences because, you know, they're attending rituals all around the world, especially in traditional cultures, you know. And they say, I'll never write it down, though. It'll be like death to my career.
Exactly. And then that is one of the most amazing things that I really appreciate about your book, Peter, because reading it, you approach things with a very, as you mentioned, ethnographic perspective, a very dedicated, showing fidelity to scholarship perspective. And at the same time, you bring in from the historical record about that in this deck. I think there's a paragraph in the book where you also talk about effectively the successful operator, whether that's the head of the D'Este household getting ready to go to war, or whoever's using this deck, effectively achieves this voluntary possession of the deity. And the kundalini, the actual energy there, I think you use the phrase, it effectively collapses the stratification of consciousness, where most of us build up our reality with these, you know, thin little toothpick-like pegs holding up our reality. Yeah. And this collapses everything into a node of zero, effectively. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, essentially, when the kundalini rises, it does collapse the energetic supports of the persona, and it opens awareness to merge with a higher reality. And generally, that higher reality is a higher intelligence, higher form of life, being. Okay, and the deities are characterized by their ecstatic awareness, so that the ecstatic awareness of possession is the sharing of God consciousness, which is our natural inheritance. It's our natural state, and can be our state again. You don't have to, so to speak, become enlightened in this lifetime. That's probably not a reasonable thing to even think or talk about. You know, if you were going to be the Buddha, you would be the Buddha already. You know, if you're going to be Picasso, you would have been Picasso when you were 8 years old, you know. So I always want to shift spiritual talk more to service, which is, what are you doing? Rather than enlightenment, you know, which is pretty well in the hands of the deities that you work with.
I guess this begs the question, Peter, something you intimated before, which is, who created the deck? who created the deck's themes and the layout, and also, as you mentioned, who designed the deck itself. Obviously, listeners, I'm going to encourage everyone to pick up a copy of The Game of Saturn to find out all of the details. But is there anything that we haven't discussed so far that you'd like to share, Peter?
No, I think we touched the bases very well. I said the deck, I believe, I can't think of another significant figure other than Prisciani himself. You know, the fact that he did the Palazzo Schifanoia frescoes, strong on the fact that he was the court astrologer. You know, he had that in-depth magical knowledge. He was also the court archivist. He looked after the library. He grew and, you know, he knew the volumes intimately. Whenever they had another project to do, he'd be the guy who'd go and do the original research for the D'Este. You know, whether it was architectural, theatrical, whatever it was, he would always provide the primary source materials and references. So, you know, I can't imagine a project as prestigious, as important, and as big as the Solar Busca would ever bypass him. There's no way. There's just no way. He was a commanding presence in that court. And he had all the attributes and knowledge, resources at his fingertips to do it. You know, it's an absolutely stunning achievement, I have to say.
We do, Peter, have a listener question as well from Simone Kotva, who says, I've read Peter's book, and I wonder what Peter makes of the latest interpretation of the deck by Andrea Vitali, which accompanies the new Lo Scarabeo edition. It's so different from Peter's work, opting for more conventional Christological keys with which to open the deck, but also new dating, new word plays. And Simone says, I would be intrigued to hear what Peter's thoughts are on this.
Well, we talked about the dating right at the beginning. The study that Mark Zucker has made of this deck has placed it firmly in Ferrara, 1480, 1490, not in Venice, certainly not a century later, 1570. So that cuts the entire ground out of this alternative interpretation from the beginning. The attempt to use anagrams to read the text on the shields is equally mistaken because the date of 1570 doesn't bear any resemblance whatsoever. On top of that, the historical context that I've provided, the presence of the Venier, Sanudo, coats of arms, the initials MS, the fact that Sanudo was at that time deeply engaged with the court in Ferrara, negotiating the terms, that he was subsequently never trusted by the Venetian elite ever again, that he subsequently came into a vast amount of money, made this huge library. There's a context here which is totally missing in this alternative reality, let's call it. Another criticism, if I may, is that a lot of the descriptions I have read of the cards take the name, give a historical summary of the biography of that name, and don't allude to any detail whatsoever actually appearing on the card. You know, and for me, this is completely unacceptable. Because of the ethnographic approach, the history, and the way in which the cards are designed, the level of specification they've had, the clear references to the Chaldean oracles, to clergy, to Neoplatonism, all of this stuff has to be accounted for. And just to take the name of the card and give a brief summary of the biography of someone who sounds like that. It's not even a direct relationship. Oh, that name sounds like such and such, and he did this. That's simply not acceptable in terms of, exegesis.
I know myself and the listeners thank you for that additional context as well. And a question that I sent you, as I say, in a moment of shameful coffee-fueled curiosity is, okay, I'm wondering if you yourself have ever perhaps engaged with this deck in a ritualistic fashion, or, of course, I know that specifically for practitioners, details and things like that are better left private, but do you know anyone who, ever since the publication of the book, have maybe reached out to you or who have worked this deck ritually?
My own experience of researching and writing this deck is that I was intermittently taken over by a huge energy inflow. I mean, I'm an energy healer. I mean, I practice energy healing, self-healing on a daily basis, have done for 20 years. The energy that came in during the course of writing this was frankly overwhelming. I was like locked, paralyzed for 3 to 4 days at a time. It was so powerful. In my teens, I had Kundalini rising several times. I know it very well. This was of another order of power. Unless you were completely dedicated to this deity, to some daily devotional sadhana, literally, practice, I can't imagine being able to encompass the quality, the fierceness of energy associated with it. I wouldn't wish it on anyone, to be honest. This was also associated with what I call signs following. You know, for those people who practice a more traditional magical approach, signs following are the verification that you're on the right track. My wife, who's very sensitive, started receiving on a particular day the word Elohim. And it went on all day long. Elohim, Elohim, Elohim. She kept coming to me, you've got to check this out. And I was thinking, what the heck is Elohim? I've never heard of that. I've heard of Elohim. But this is not the Kabbalah. I said, come on, this has got to be wrong. And then some days later, I going through Athenagoras' 2nd century CE text, right? And embedded in there is a lost work, fragmentary pieces from a lost work of a Hellenistic philosopher. So it's like 4th century BCE. And it said, Elos is another name of Saturn, and the followers of Saturn are known as the Elohim. And this is the first time I ever read it. You know, that's what we call signs following. So throughout the process of writing this, I was continuously nudged in certain directions, had certain resources and quotations, and just like, you know, pushed in front of me. Makes me wonder if I was the author really, you know, at the end of the day. It was guided. Writing as a service is a spiritual path, and it's also a ritual process. And this is my theurgy.
And what a comprehensive theurgistic tome it is, because it really does elucidate and shifts the consciousness. I mean, I will forever and continue to go over the details and try and make new connections, but I'm forever changed because of the book and how you added that context and showed how there are these beautiful tributaries that are running throughout the deck. And yeah. I think, Peter, too, that leads to a question that also ties into your own energetic work and seeing things, as you mentioned, kind of having a sight. And this goes to a listener question from Douglas of the What Magic Is This podcast, who says, it is the British filmmaker Peter Greenaway's contention that, quote, most people are visually illiterate. Why should it be otherwise? We have a text-based culture. Our educational systems teach us to value text over image, which is one of the reasons that we have such a poverty of visual literacy. So Douglas is asking, Peter, would you agree with that assessment that we no longer read images as we once did, and that the symbols, which used to have great importance to us, are merely lifeless now, that we lack the comparative skills necessary to see deeper aspects of the visual art? Thank you, Douglas says, and he says that your work is inspiring and amazing.
Thank you, Douglas. Peter Greenaway's Draftsman's Contract is one of my favorite films of all time, I have to say. The Draftsman's Contract. I think he's right in essence, and the service in books like Game of Saturn, in my latest book, Misty, is the attempt to restore this visual context of metaphysics, of ritual, of other dimensions and other dimensional entities and beings, okay? That's what I'm about. And really looking at different forms of art. So that, for instance, Game of Saturn is a deck of cards. Misty are the frescoes of the Villa of the Mysteries in Pompeii. I'm currently working on the possibility of writing about the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul as the last and greatest temple of Saturn, because it was designed by people who were trained by Proclus and his descendants. There's a direct mathematical, architectural, and geometric progression from the School of Athens the heart of the Neoplatonic vision to the architects who actually worked on that structure. And I'm at present elucidating that sacred geometry as a theurgic instrument in the large. Okay, so we're going like from deck of cards to a room to a building. And after that, I have to move to a landscape. But it's logical.
Peter, that is incredible. And you are joining us from Istanbul right now. I mean, that is incredible.
Yeah, that's right. I lived here for many, many decades. And, you know, but this is a very new insight. I spent many hours in there and examining all of the material about it and its construction. We're some way through to that. I hope that sees the light of day soon. The edifice may well be reverting to a mosque in the near future. So I have a window of opportunity to do this. And if it works, it will be an articulation again of that Neoplatonic metaphysical and theurgic tradition in the large into the sacred geometry. Okay, that's what I want to try and describe, bring alive to people. Let's see if that works.
Your newly released tome, as you mentioned, Mistai. Can you share a little bit, just kind of the broad strokes about the importance of the frescoes and what you kind of go through in Mistai?
Mistai is just out from Scarlet Imprint. It's subtitled Dancing Out the Mysteries of Dionysus. It is an exegesis of what I consider to be the single most important esoteric narrative to have survived from the age of paganism. The Dionysian-themed fresco cycle of Pompeii's Villa of the Mysteries is the only surviving depiction of the ritual activity actually undertaken during a mystery initiation. It's egregore and the epiphany of the mystery deities. They're all contained within that cycle. And Mistai is the first, and to my knowledge, the only complete exegesis of that ritual process. And therefore the only exegesis of the process of initiation into the mysteries. That is another work of deep ritual insight and reconstruction.
What are some of the other projects? I know you have many irons and many fires. Is there anything else in terms of projects or new areas of focus that you'd like to expand upon that you've already shared, or anything else that you think listeners might need to keep their ear to the ground on?
In the present context, the most interesting one is the start of a process creating a documentary of the game of Saturn, along with the filmmaker Andrew Smith. So presently we're working on a promotion for that. We then need to take the promotion to the various distribution and sales channels and see if we can get the funding to make the full documentary. But that is actually underway at present. Okay, we've been working on it for the past couple of weeks to make good progress. I hope that that'll be going forward in the near future. Another one is my book, The Healing Field, this summation and reflection on 20 years of intense energy healing in terms of our models of consciousness and other worlds, other dimensions, intersubjectivity, and our relationship with that. I hope we'll be coming out with Inner Traditions this fall. I already mentioned the project on Hagia Sophia, and there's another project lined up behind that again, which will also be about mystery initiation in a different tradition. That's at a very early stage of development. Anyone who's interested in poetry, I'm writing routinely for the Cobblestone Press literary journal, Reliquy, a kind of journal of esoteric spiritual landscape, I would say, myth. So I regularly appear over there as well. So that's about it for now.
That's all? Wow.
That's all.
No,
I was writing a book of poetry, but it's going very slowly. I don't seem to have time for that.
I can't imagine why, Peter. I can't. What is the legacy of the Solabusca deck as we see it now, Peter? One of the big themes I'm getting is there's so much more to be discovered, but what would you like listeners to remember in terms of the legacy of the deck and what it really is?
There's an Indo-Tibetan tradition called Vajrayana. Okay, deity yoga. And that's an initiatory tradition that allows you to merge consciousness momentarily with the deity. And then through that momentary experience of enlightened awareness to develop your spiritual life. I feel that encoded within the game of Saturn, within the deck of cards, are processes analogous to that. Once we discard the Christianizing interpretive lens, we're no longer faced with the play of good, evil, sin, and so on. What we're seeing there is the pure outcome of a Hellenistic tradition of over 2,000 years made accessible to us today. So taking that as a fresh perspective on the thing and looking at the ritual processes encoded within it, here is a working system of elite magic now made accessible to everybody. I think that's how I'd like to sum it up.
Incredible context as usual. Peter Mark Adams, author, poet, essayist, practitioner of tarot, an esotericist, a professional energy worker, as well as many, many, many other areas of expertise. Peter, just thank you so much for taking the time and the gift of your wisdom and generosity in stopping by the podcast today. Really, really appreciate it.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, Alex, and I really look forward to coming back on in the near future. We'll do a tour of the Villa of the Mysteries and initiation into the cult of Dionysus. Look forward to that.
All right, listeners, all I can say after that chat with Peter Mark Adams is, wow, his scholarship, analysis, context, his spirit, his humor, all come together in a wonderful alchemical elixir that really raises your consciousness. I really hope it did for you. Also, I love how Peter invites us ourselves to explore the Sola Busca deck, to make new connections that reveal even more about what is actually embedded and encoded in this Renaissance masterwork. And Peter's work on the Hagia Sophia sounds incredible and unique, and I definitely cannot wait to hear more about that as well. Thanks to Peter Mark Adams for his time and his wisdom, and also thanks to Alkistis and Peter from Scarlet Imprint for always crafting high-quality presentations of literature and esotericism. And a big thanks to each and every Glitch Bottle patron on Patreon and your wonderful and elucidating questions for our guests, including Peter. As usual, they take the conversation into new areas of exploration. And if you are interested in having a reserved seat on the Glitch Bottle Caravan, you can always get exclusive content by supporting Glitch Bottle on Patreon, and you can always subscribe to Glitch Bottle on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Spreaker.com, and Stitcher Radio. As always, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.